You know, it can be easy to forget that The Sims originally started off as a spin-off of SimCity, considering how quickly it managed to eclipse the popularity of its parent series. So it makes a lot of sense that EA wasted little time publishing spin-offs of their spin-off. Now, none of these titles ever managed to replicate the success of The Sims, but they all have their fans, and you can't talk about beloved Sims spin-offs without mentioning the Urbz, Sims in the City. As its name implies, the Urbz, Sims in the City, took your Sims out of the comforts of suburbia and moved them into the mean streets of Urbzville, where building your reputation takes priority over climbing the corporate ladder. But that wasn't the only change. In an attempt to appeal to a younger audience, Will Wright's Little Computer People were also given something of a facelift, and while Katy Perry might get all the credit and or blame for introducing licensed music into the franchise, the trend of having artists re-record Simless versions of some of their biggest hits actually originated here in the Urbz. Now, the Urbz didn't sell as well as EA had been hoping for, but it did resonate with a number of those who played it, and these fans have spent the last 20 years holding out hope for a sequel or a remake. And while it's easy to be cynical and assume the reason that we've never gotten any sort of follow-up is because EA is too busy forcing Maxis to milk the cash cow known as The Sims 4, truth be told, the reason we've never gotten any sort of follow-up to the Urbz is probably just because the original kinda sucked.
No, you're lying! You're lying! What makes you lie?
What's up everybody, Dusty here, and before you all grab your pitchforks and get a good old-fashioned witch hunt going, I'd just like to point out that I did not go into this video planning on bashing one of your childhood favorites. Like many of you, I also had fond childhood memories of playing the Urbz, and if you're already familiar with my channel, then you know that I enjoy finding a way to make somewhat coherent stories out of my gameplays, and that was my intention. But then I played the game.
I've made a huge mistake.
There's numerous reasons as to why exactly I did not enjoy my return trip to Urbzville, but let's start with the story, although it's so abstract that even referring to it as such is being extremely generous. After creating your Urb, you move into your new apartment where you're greeted by your best buddy Will.I.Am, who introduces you to Darius, the coolest cat in the city. Darius takes a liking to you and tells you to go out and build your reputation by being the biggest poser in the city to impress all the locals. There's also a number of villains who are harassing everybody, so if you could take care of them and collect all the pieces of Darius' secret machine form, then that would be totally cool, and he'll give you the keys to a super sweet penthouse to show you just how much he appreciates it. Now, if you feel like you might have missed something, don't worry, because you're not the only one. No, I'm not going to pretend that the first Sims game on consoles or Bustin' Out had the deepest stories, but they did find a way to provide some context for your actions. There's some actual logic behind the thought process of helping out around the house in order to convince your mom to lend you some money so you can move out on your own. In the Urbz, though, you just jump around from one district to the next without any rhyme or reason other to increase your social standing and help out Darius in a roundabout way. Also, and I can't stress this enough, who the fuck is Darius? EA spent what I assume was a decent chunk of change to get the Black Eyed Peas to appear in the game and contribute some music for the soundtrack, yet for some reason, instead of taking center stage, they're all presented as a bunch of nobodies aside from Will.I.Am. You'd think that gaining access to their bar so you could hang out with the band would be the ultimate prize instead of Darius' penthouse, but instead you could pick it as your starting district and turn all of them into your BFFs within like 20 minutes. I just can't understand the thought process here. Again though, it's not like a good or even coherent story is an essential component to a Sims game. I mean, if the Urbz had delivered a fresh, unique take on the formula, then it could have still proven itself to be a worthy addition to the franchise. Instead, the gameplay quickly proves itself to be just as half-baked as the rest of the experience. The cracks begin to appear right from the start. Unlike the rest of the series, the Urbz doesn't bog you down with all those pesky personality points, so you don't have to worry about your Urb displaying any sort of individuality. In addition to this, your options for fine-tuning your character's appearance aren't as extensive as they could be. Like, I get that you have to travel to the various districts to unlock all the clothing options, but why the hell can't I change my character's eye color? And that's not me unfairly criticizing the game for not holding up to modern standards. You could change your eye color in the first Sims game on consoles. But it doesn't take long to realize that's the least of your worries, and that's because you soon discover that the Urbz is a mind-numbing exercise in monotony. Repetitive doesn't even begin to describe the Urbz. The game boasts that it has 9 levels, but really it feels more like Maxis just made one level 9 times and switched out a few textures and objects and called it a day. Every single level follows the exact same formula. First, you take a job so you can afford some new clothes. This is extremely important because if you don't shamelessly sell out and give into conformity, then your fellow Urbz will have no interest in being your friend. And befriending certain Urbz is absolutely essential as it unlocks new social interactions, which you are then forced to spam to make more or friends to further build up your reputation. As Darius established at the beginning of the game, rep is everything in Urbzville, and getting access to the prestigious VIP parties and unlocking new districts to visit both revolve around it, so it doesn't take long to become incredibly familiar with some of these interactions. Now, to give credit where credit's due, checking out all the social interactions is always a highlight in these games, and it's clear that the team at Maxis had a ton of fun coming up with these animations, which are even more over the top than usual. That being said though, as great as they are, once you've seen the rave animation for the 5th time in as many minutes, it does lose some of its charm. But far worse are the minigames you have to participate in when your Urbz are on the clock or building their skills. Listen, I understand that I'm not the typical Sims fan and that a lot of those people would be considered casual gamers. However, just because you're a casual gamer doesn't mean you should have to settle for the bare minimum. But apparently the bare minimum is all the effort Maxis was willing to give here in the Urbz. Now, for an example of how to do minigames right, let's take a look at Bully. In Bully, you have to attend numerous classes which are all represented by their own minigame. None of these minigames are complex. In fact, most of them are glorified versions of the types of flash games that dominated the internet in the early 2000s. But most of them are also fun and short bursts, and none of them overstay their welcome, and they provide that game with some variety, which you know is kind of the whole point of a good minigame. Well, apparently nobody told this to Maxis. Every single job in the Urbz is represented by the exact same minigame where you have to press the buttons that pop up on screen in the proper order. Literally every single one. From a gameplay perspective, there's absolutely no difference between tending bar, stripping down bikes in a chop shop, or acting as a model. Every job also has 3 different difficulty levels, and each of the 9 districts features its own job, so some basic math will let you know that you're going to be doing these far more than you'd like. And that's without even taking into account you have to pay the rent or the extra expenses that would be incurred if you did for some reason actually care about properly furnishing your apartments or filling out your wardrobe. Of course, gaining access to one of those higher difficulty levels requires you to build your character's skills, and somehow Maxis managed to put even less effort into this area of the game. Now obviously in the main game, building your skills is a completely passive experience that doesn't require any input from the player, and in my opinion it's one of the weakest aspects of those games, so I'm personally not opposed to the idea of retooling it to make it more interactive. That being said, whoever made the decision that each of these minigames should just have the player mash the A button repeatedly is a fucking idiot, and I hope they were blacklisted from the gaming industry afterwards. Seriously, what the hell was it about this era of gaming that had developers convinced that including mechanics that would force your players to break their controllers was a good idea? And that's not hyperbole, the A button on my controller is completely scuffed now after playing the Urbz, so I have Maxis to thank for the fact that I've now got a $50 paperweight. But even overlooking the damage that these minigames will cause you to inflict upon your hardware, the whole thing just reeks of laziness. I'll admit that there is a certain logic to button mashing when your character is improving their body skill, but when your Urbz is honing their mind with a game of chess or working on their creativity, it really doesn't fit. I mean, I know making games isn't easy, but would have killed Maxis to have somebody throw together a simple rhythm game or come up with some basic chess scenarios for the player to work through. And the Urbz also just utterly fails to live up to its premise of Sims in the City. Obviously, it would have been unfair to expect Maxis to deliver a Sims 3 style sandbox on consoles way back in 2004, but the various districts you visit in the Urbz aren't all that much larger than the biggest lots from the previous games, and it's not like they're packed with a bunch of secrets for players to uncover. The fact that you just go to these locations by picking them from a menu and then staring at a static loading screen also doesn't help the illusion that this is supposed to be one big interconnected city. A simple animated loading screen of your sim on the subway would have done wonders, and Maxis had already included something similar in The Sims Bustin' Out, so I have no idea why they didn't return to the concept here. And then on top of all these issues, at its core, the Urbz is just a half-assed Sims experience. Sure, on the surface it offers all the familiar trappings of the series as you have to maintain your character's needs, and you can socialize with numerous NPCs, but it doesn't take long to realize that the experience is just as shallow as all the characters you encounter. One of the cornerstones of the franchise is how it allows players to make their own fun, but you'll find that sort of thing is discouraged during your time with the Urbz. As I alluded to earlier, the whole game is based around your rep, and the primary way to build your rep is by doing interactions that your fellow Urbz approve of. Doing interactions that they don't like will cause your reputation to drop, which means the game basically punishes players who don't play the right way. And even once you've beaten the game and have been given the keys to Darius's penthouse, it still lacks the true freeform nature that makes the other titles in the series so special. You can't get married or have kids or anything like that, and none of the characters in the game can be killed, so even on the few occasions that something potentially interesting like a fire breaking out does occur, it doesn't actually have any consequence. And because the status quo never actually changes, it means that all those unique, interesting stories that have a habit of playing out in the other games are nowhere to be found. So if the Urbz had all these issues, then you might be wondering why it's so beloved these days. Well, considering how it failed to live up to EA's expectations, I would guess that, like myself, a lot of those people never actually owned the Urbz when it first released, and instead rented it back when that was still a thing that people did. And that business model helped create a lot of nostalgia for games that might not deserve it. As I'm sure many others can attest to, back when you were a kid, Blockbuster Night was like a little mini holiday. You'd be so hyped up just to go browse through all the box art and pick some new games to play that whatever you ended up taking home already had a ton of goodwill built up with you. And even if you didn't exactly like a game you had rented, you didn't feel nearly as compelled to try and force yourself to get some measure of enjoyment out of it the way you would if you had unknowingly blown a few weeks' allowance on that same dog turd. You just play it 2 or 3 times, take it back to exchange for another game, and then move on with your life until you see a post about it 15 years later on Facebook or Reddit, and by that point you can't even really remember whether or not you actually liked the game, you just know that you played it. But for those who truly did enjoy the Urbz back in the day, I have to imagine that the 2-player mode did a lot of the heavy lifting here. I've always maintained that even the worst games become infinitely more playable when you add in co-op. Misery loves company after all, and if you weren't too concerned about building your rep and actually progressing through the game, then I can see there being some fun to be had by just terrorizing the locals with a buddy by your side. Granted, you could have a better 2-player experience by playing pretty much any of the other Sims games on consoles from around this time, but hey, I'm trying to be nice here. But let's be honest, when most people look back on the Urbz, they don't think about the story or the gameplay. When people look back on the Urbz, the first thing that comes to mind is the vibe, and that vibe is so aggressively mid-2000s that I've got the sudden urge to bump some Gwen Stefani in 3 Days Grace. Obviously, this means it didn't take long for it to become incredibly dated, but that's also the exact reason so many people have such strong nostalgia for it. The Urbz isn't just a game, it's effectively a time capsule that preserves a moment in history. So while I might not agree with the common consensus that's this overlooked gem, I do understand why it resonated with some of its players. Still, for anybody out there looking to take a trip down memory lane, I'd have to advise against it. I know nostalgia can be a powerful drug, but some memories truly are better left in the past. Hey again everybody, Dusty here, and I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you didn't, then I have no idea why I'd still be hanging around, but whatever, you do you. However, if you did enjoy it, then why not leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel so you can be kept up to date with all my latest content. Or don't let me tell you how to live your life. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching, I'm out.